how really is that going to work?
Okay, yeah. As I said, it could also be looked at symbolically. The idea is that you have this passport. It'll galvanize the heads of states to quickly ratify, move fast on the treaty. But also what was announced when the passport was presented. It was also urging member states, in other words, all the African countries, to recognize the passport and allow the bearer into the country, notwithstanding the fact that there might not be a visa there. That might well be possible, but there's no legal basis to that. If a country allows somebody with an AU passport to enter, without a visa. Now, it's to be seen whether, because AU officials, it's like the United Nations has a passport called the laissez-passer as well, and again, it's the same sort of thing. Some countries will recognize it without any need for a visa for the bearer. But it's usually it's a bilateral action that's required. It's for each country to put in place a mechanism. So as far as Nigeria is concerned, our immigration authorities, maybe the legislature might have to be involved, might be ready to recognize the AU passport, and any bearer of an AU passport could enter into the country, freely. But if that is not done, then there's no legal obligation, at the border to let anybody in with such a passport. So essentially, the legal status is that, is that there is none.
None, basically. Now, I'm wondering, there were a whole lot of African countries, representatives from different African countries at the Kigali event. What was the level of commitment of those countries towards embracing this passport?
Oh yes, enthusiastically. I mean, because the concept of a united Africa, an integrated Africa, is one that everybody has bought into. Pretty much. I mean, every head of state and most Africans, to be honest with you, and it's been something that has represented an aspiration and an ideal since decolonization. You can remember in the days of Nkrumah and all the early African fathers, Africa must unite, one Africa, and so forth. So it's something that resonates with Africans, that yearning for true African unity. So yes, it was welcomed, and it's a good thing. I mean, I think this really represents the future, I think, for Africa.
All right, Honorable Minister, let's quickly take a look at the treaty. It wasn't ratified yet. The passport is out. Let's look at the content of that. What was left out in the process of ratifying the treaty, and why the possibility of the passport not having effect just yet? What is going to be the downturn on the launch?
Okay, regarding the treaty, there is not a treaty yet that has been adopted. There are drafts,
Okay.
a draft treaty on the free movement of peoples in Africa. So you obviously have to finalize the treaty and then have countries sign the treaty and then ratify, domesticate, as it were, by their parliaments or legislature or whatever. But the effect of the situation you have really is that now you have a passport that has been issued, and obviously if you have a passport, the idea of the passport is, well, first of all, it's an identity, a form of identity, so it serves that purpose, it's a form of identity. But then ideally, it should get you into a country, be recognized by the country that's receiving you, and that country receiving you with that passport might either require you to have a visa inside the passport or recognize the passport as enabling you to come in without a visa. So the ideal would be, of course, that such a passport would enable you to enter any country in Africa without a visa. Okay, that legally is not what it does, because there is no treaty upon which it is based. But what was issued were diplomatic passports to heads of states. They haven't started issuing them to the ordinary folks on, on the street.
The idea is before 2018 that African citizens should have them.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, that was the original, maybe, idea. But when it was announced on this occasion, the chairperson of the AU Commission, Madam Zuma, she said that due to popular demand across the continent, people complaining why should it only be for heads of states and senior government officials, that it should be for everybody. The AU bought into that, and so she now is proposing that the process of issuing this passport should be decentralized. In other words, you'll have a template for the passport. It will now be sent to all the countries, and each individual country, like you have with the ECOWAS passport, can now issue, as it were, on behalf of the AU the AU passport, but sort of like AU passport, Nigeria, as you have with ECOWAS, a ECOWAS passport, Nigeria, then, with all the other countries, that can now go ahead. So, so in fact, the situation is that countries will be able to issue it to whoever they want, was the words she used. So
Now,
citizens
let's look at Nigeria and what would likely be our approach towards, if eventually we have a treaty coming on board and we sign up to the treaty, would we be ready to domesticate the treaty so that it can go into, we're looking at the peculiar challenges, the reality on ground, some of the issues that may affect not just Nigeria but other African countries from moving forward to accepting it wholesale and full implementation of it and opening the borders of their country. Issues of security has been raised. It's in fact one of the top issues that has been raised by many people that may be the biggest impediment to the implementation of these passports. The porous borders in Africa is a key concern. Nigeria, so many we can't even deal with. Are we ready to accept a system like this that would further, open the borders completely?
To anybody. Well, these are challenges. What would have to be done would be to, upgrade your security architecture at your borders. This is something that we should be doing anyway, and also your internal security and so forth. I think actually the question you asked will be more of a problem, I think, for the smaller countries, other smaller countries, rather Nigeria. Nigeria has 180 million people. So, all the other a lot of the other African countries much less, and would actually, in a sense, present much, less of a problem. But one could imagine that some of the smaller countries would balk at the idea of free entry to 180 million people, probably more than Nigeria will be balking at the same concept. But your point is well taken. It's something that came up, that was discussed by the heads of state, the issue of security, and and the steps that would need to be taken if we completely open up all the borders on the continent. But that is a challenge. But it will call on greater cooperation and possibly also some of the countries would have to also look at who they issue passports to.
Is the AU taking a look at helping to curb some of the violence that we see across Africa? You've talked about the population of Nigeria and the fact that smaller countries will cringe at the thought of having 180 million people sweep into their country at any point in time. But there's also the worry of countries that are war-torn around Africa, countries that are going through serious difficulties, economic difficulties and war. And a country like Nigeria that is dealing with the menace of Boko Haram, would other countries really be readily available to allow this cross-border interaction without making sure that the AU itself has been able to put on-ground security mechanism that will protect other countries who are not going through the same challenges that some of us are faced with?
Well, ultimately, you know, the responsibility for the security of any given country rests with that country, you know. It's for each country to really put in place the security mechanisms and apparatus it requires for its security. But speaking continentally and, you know, the responsibility of the African Union to provide security, the move in Africa within the AU is peace and security architecture. So, for instance, there is an African standby force that has been created, and the idea of this African standby force is for swift deployment to any conflict zone on the
Another question would be,
continent.
how effective is that African standby force?
Well, it's just been created. We have to, you know, wait and see. I think the first challenge is because the way it's going to work is that each country will allocate, as it were, a number of troops for that. And so it's a question of coordination, command and control. So if there's a trouble spot and the decision is taken to move in, they would obviously have to decide where the troops will come from and to deploy them rapidly. So, I mean, in principle, it should work. There's been some exercises carried out to make sure that, you know, it's functioning and fit for purpose. And, you know, the verdict after the exercises has been that this rapid deployment force is ready to operate. So that's the continental architecture that's being built for peace and security around the region. But as I said, ultimately, especially in the context of insurgencies and so forth, the first line of defense is the country itself. You know, all the countries of the world today just have to be heightened alert because it is a global menace.
A critic for us, Minister, if you may, I mean, the role of the AU, it's been in existence after transmutating from the OAU to the AU. It's several conflicts in Africa and interventions have come in, but most of the interventions have been from outside powers. I mean, the situation in Libya was very clear. We saw that the AU didn't make much input to that, and foreign powers outside Africa seem to have led the charge and ousted an African leader who, rightly or wrongly, might be controversial, but a lot of people saw him as an hero of sorts. How far has the AU, since we're still talking about integration and Africa leading Africa, how far has the AU performed in that?
That's a very good point you raise. That's a very good point, and I think that's a major criticism of the African Union, that at the end of the day, we have not been the masters of our own destiny or in control of the situation on our continent. And as you rightly say, a lot of the crises and conflicts on the continent we have seen essentially, as you say, powers outside Africa really taking charge and dictating the narrative and the evolution of those. And that's one of the things that I think the heads of states are now really trying to grapple with and get on top of. One of the reasons, obviously, I think is just resources, financial resources, you know, that a lot of the countries just didn't have. So whenever there's a conflict, and as in fact the situation today is that outside donors actually fund most of the program of the African Union. So that's another issue that came up during this this summit. How can Africa take charge of the organization itself? Because it's not sustainable if you have outside countries, outside powers, who actually are paying for all your programs. You know, and I think that's the same with the point you raised, you know, about these conflicts, that the resources are just not there. And so even if the African countries take a position, they feel completely impotent in terms of really taking charge.
But apart from the financial resources, Minister, there's also the issue of whether there's a vacuum in terms of leadership. Somebody, a strong African country like Nigeria used to do shortly after independence, through the apartheid period in South Africa, asserting itself through a leadership, through a foreign policy objective that says, this is Africa, it is a centerpiece, and we'll pursue whatever we can within our resources to ensure that we bring Africa together. There seemed to be an absence in terms of leadership. A strong country and a strong leader, showing leadership in Africa. Why is that the case?
Well, okay, there are a number of things. These are different times. In those days, when the issues are black and white, it's a lot easier to take a firm position one way or the other. So when you're dealing with African decolonization, as in the days when you were talking about, if you look at the situation in Angola, when there was a fight to decolonize those Portuguese-speaking countries, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, at the time, of course it was clear where Africa stood. Africa stood on the side of decolonization, identified one of the movements that really represented genuine African independence. So it was much easier to really take a firm stand and say, this is what we want and this is what we're going to get. Decolonize Angola under the leadership of this group of liberation movement. And of course Nigeria also had the resources at the time. Nigeria was probably the apogee of our financial resources. So you also have some muscle behind the position you're taking. I think we could nationalize British Petroleum at that time, and so on and so forth, because oil prices had just catapulted. But when the issues are not so clear, it's not so easy. So if you take Libya, yes, Gaddafi was a champion of African union, but he was anathema to the rest of the Arab countries, which is why they did absolutely nothing and actually were quite, happy and supported the intervention at the United Nations, that authorized it. And then there was an uprising within his country, and the sense you got was that the majority of the people were rising up against, against his rule. And it's always difficult in those kinds of situations when you're dealing with internal affairs of countries, and then it was during the Arab Spring, and you saw this, sort of, yes, a domino effect in that region. So it was a bit, so it was not as straightforward as that, for an African country to come and start,
But we had African leaders who spoke up. People like Nelson Mandela spoke up. Thabo Mbeki spoke up. I think when the no-fly zone was passed, and they spoke up strongly on why that shouldn't be the case. But I'm also wanting us to look at the issue of our foreign policy, because that was also the second leg of my question. What really is Nigerian foreign policy at the moment? Some people feel it's not very clear. We don't know what direction Nigeria's foreign policy is going. I mean, we've been taking part in interventions. We've been playing leadership roles in Africa, even on the sub-region, in ECOWAS interventions in Liberia, in Sierra Leone. But at the end of the day, Nigerians are still being kicked about in those countries years after, and citizens of those countries don't seem to remember the role played by Nigeria. And it does appear that Nigeria too doesn't take advantage of some of the things it has done to bring stability to some of those countries. What really is our foreign policy, and is our foreign policy of benefit to us, to our national interest?
Yes, there's always this undercurrent of some narrative about, our foreign policy, Nigerians being maltreated, around the continent. And I really, don't know where this comes from. But, our foreign policy is very, is very clear. First and foremost, and I think it's the foreign policy of most of the countries of the world today, is your economy. You have to get your economy. The days of military glory have gone. And, countries are trying to reduce their military spending, and use those resources to improve the lives of their people. You know, that's really the bottom line. And today, you know, countries are striving to be at the top of the pile. It's a global market and it's very competitive. So first and foremost, we have to position our country to be able to take advantage of the economic space, the global economic space. To do that, you have to have good relations with all countries. And you know, one of the things that, if you look at Nigeria's foreign policy, Nigeria is one of the very few countries that doesn't have any natural enemies around the world. There's no country you could look at and say, oh, you know, Nigeria doesn't get on with this country. That's a very, very big achievement, and that is extremely important because that alone gives you a lot of leverage. You know, Nigeria has been elected to the Security Council now, you know, about twice or so in a very short space of time. So Nigeria's prestige in the multilateral framework is very high, and that's because of that, you know, the quiet, soft diplomacy of maintaining good relations. It might seem as something that is not that important, but if you look at our struggle with Boko Haram, then you appreciate the importance of good neighborliness, as Mr. President, you know, has pointed out. If we didn't have Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Benin, which is not even a Lake Chad basin country, voluntarily coming in to help, and that helped us to turn the tide of battle against Boko Haram, you could see that that policy is actually working. The policy or the approach of I'm the giant of Africa, I demand this, I demand respect for this, I demand you other countries, you know, to bend down once we, at our will, you might not have had such enthusiastic support, you know, in the fight against, you know, Boko Haram. Even Cameroon, for instance, that we've had issues with over the Bakassi and so forth, you know, has been very strong and extremely supportive, and we have, you know, about 60,000 Nigerian refugees being looked after by them, you know, at great cost to them. So when you're looking at foreign policy, you have to look at the interest of the country, you know. It's not about beating the war drums and shouting out, you know, Nigeria is the greatest country in Africa and therefore we demand, you know, this, that and the other. And then, you know, when we talk about Nigerians and the treatment of Nigerians in a lot of these countries, again, one has to be, it's about soft diplomacy. Like if you look at the South Africa, for instance, you know, what happened. The president of South Africa, you know, came here and stood up and said, you know, Nigeria, this is a brother country, and sending that message, you know, across to the people of South Africa. And a lot of Nigerians are doing extremely well. But of course, you know, it makes good news also, you know, to highlight, you know, issues, you know, where a Nigerian has been killed in this country or in that country.
Yes, because that takes us to the issue of citizen diplomacy as well. I mean, citizen-centered foreign policy. That's where some Nigerians also feel there's not been much protection from the government, and the kind of compulsion. We're not really talking, like you said, about Nigeria doing, you know, a superhero kind of thing, but you know, asserting yourself in such a manner that your citizens in whatever part of the country will be, of the world, will be respected. The details and the data speaks for itself. I mean, in the United Arab Emirates, where Nigerian students have gone to attend colleges, a number of them have been killed. Recently, we had one in Italy, but the good thing is that the government there reacted very strongly to it. In India, the cases have been so much. I mean, in different parts of Africa as well. In Angola, Nigerians in prisons there and treated very badly. In South Africa, the issue has been in the news for quite a while. It does appear in the minds of some Nigerians, or most Nigerians, that perhaps because the government hasn't really shown that its citizens matter, just like somebody would say in the case of the United States, for instance, where a citizen of the U.S. in any other country will be treated with some caution, knowing that, you know, you're dealing with, you know what you're dealing with. That's the kind of situation we are having here, and that's the kind of perception, public perception Nigerians are having. I'm wondering if the government is conscious of that and is addressing that adequately.
Well, you say addressing it, because I think it's a completely false premise. there is no state-sponsored harassment, killing, kidnapping of Nigerians anywhere in the world. So,
how do the authorities in those countries react when
precisely.
it happens?
Exactly. So now we have embassies in all these countries, and the first thing that these the officials of these embassies do is to follow up on these things. And some of the things that are reported in the papers are not true. And I mean, I'll give you an example. And I followed up on that personally. They said, oh, that there's this woman in Italy. She was forcefully taken to a hospital. They removed her kidneys and all kinds of things, That's all over the media. And nothing of the sort happened. So at great expense, we had
the one in Italy I was actually referring to was the one of the Nigerian refugee and his wife who got into some arguments and was killed by some persons there.
Yeah, I mean, but the lives of Nigerians are the most important thing for this government. I mean, we have embassies around the world at great cost to us for no other reason than to protect the interests of Nigeria and Nigerians. So, I mean, that should be made absolutely clear. And we go to great lengths to do that. But, I think the point you made earlier is a salient point. What do we do when these things happen? Because there are criminals everywhere, So just as Nigerians are being killed in Italy, there was a UK girl, if you remember, that was that was killed, and ultimately those who were accused, her roommate, and others who were accused, were sort of found not guilty in the end, but there are real doubts about that. So individuals of every nationality are killed all around. There are criminals in every country, and this you cannot hide from. But the point you're making, is well taken. The important thing when these things happen is what the Nigerian representatives in those countries do. And believe you me, you cannot imagine. Of course, you're not going to stand up in the papers because very often a lot of these things are, personal, confidential, or whatever. If they were drug-related or criminal, or so you're not going to discuss all the issues necessarily, in the media. But I can assure you that our embassies in these countries intervene at every stage, and there are a number of countries at the moment where we're following up on all kinds of alleged, incidents.
All right. Honorable Minister, let me bring you back away from this now. Recently, we had the charge d'affaires of the South Sudan, had a media briefing and was talking about how much Nigeria was of help just before the two countries went their separate ways, how Nigeria invited the two men particularly involved to Abuja and was able to settle this issue. He mentioned the fact that there are UN peacekeepers in South Sudan, but he'd rather have peacekeeping forces from Africa, Nigeria particularly, because he believes that they wouldn't take the position that the UN peacekeepers, for instance, take, which according to him is just to sit by and watch and really not do much while the war rages on. You've talked about foreign policy, Nigeria's foreign policy being similar to every other country's foreign policy, building your economy, not necessarily the strength of your military. How should Nigeria respond to that? Because he wasn't calling to the AU. He was calling to Nigeria to come and assist. Does Nigeria still have the capacity to assist countries like South Sudan?
Well, it depends what you mean. Nigeria was one of the largest contributors to peacekeeping troops. We do not intervene unilaterally in countries, and never have. We always will do that, in the framework of one of the organizations. You need to get legitimacy, a legal a basis for intervention. So it's either in the framework of the United Nations, or in the framework of ECOWAS, or in the framework of the African Union. So it's in those three capacities that Nigeria used to be one of the main contributors to to peacekeeping in the UN, in AU, and in ECOWAS. But it's when you have a civil war situation, as you do, in fact, as you do in South Sudan, you have to move very clearly. I mean, in South Sudan, it's actually you have a president and you have a vice president, and each one has his army, you see, and of course you have the fault line, an ethnic fault line, which exacerbates that situation, and so you always have to move very carefully, and in the case of South Sudan, Mr. President has played a very important role, in talking to the two leaders and trying to get them to accept. There's been a peace agreement, and it's just a question of implementing that peace agreement and not reneging on it. And one of the challenges that was felt in South Sudan is how much control the president and the vice president have over their forces. And the last problems seem to suggest that there is not full control over their troops.
On both sides? On
both sides.
All right. Let's still talk about some of the issues locally. You have been in a kind of face-off with the National Assembly, Senate in particular, over the ambassadorial list that was submitted. You were quoted as saying that there's no going back and amendment of that list of 47. The debate has been, well, some states have been excluded. About 4 states, I think, Bayelsa, Ebonyi, Plateau, and one of the states, so thereabout has been excluded. But you've come out to say there's no going back on that, although the Senate has proceeded on moving ahead with the screening and confirmation of those ministers. Could you tell us why exactly those states were not included in the original list?
Well, first of all, I never said any such thing.
Well, media reports, I looked through some media reports, and Geoffrey Yama was quoted as saying no going back on that.
See, that should tell you more about the media than about me. I can assure you that I made no such comment, and you can rest assured on that. No, not at all. The list was made. There's a criteria. It's at the discretion of Mr. President. We were summoned to Senate just to explain the process, which we did, and they understood that, and they approved the list yesterday. So, there's been no problem at all. Of course, you can never please all the people all the time. Whatever appointment you make, somebody's going to feel aggrieved, and that's just the reality of things. But with that, in that case, there are 30-something other appointments to be made. There are different ways, different people, ways of appointing. Mr. President can appoint whoever he wants as an ambassador anywhere. Okay, it's completely in his gift, and so he's appointed the first batch, and there's another batch. So a lot of people have actually jumped the gun, when they said, "Oh, this state is not represented, this state is not represented," because the full quantum of ambassadors have not yet been appointed. What happened was, because it was taking a bit of time, said, "Okay, just send forward the first batch quickly," and some countries were getting a bit, anxious that there was not a Nigerian ambassador. So we decided to move, systematically forward. So there's another batch. So cool. I think countries states don't need to feel that they're not represented yet. Yeah.
All right, Honourable Minister, let's go back to the AU. Now, the AU failed to elect a new chairman of the AU Commission because none of the contestants had a two-third of the votes. Now, what are the implications of this?
None. It just means that the process is deferred to January, when the elections will take place in January.
This doesn't mean anything. What if the same thing happens again in January?
Well, the heads of state have said, well, one or two, suggested that if we cannot reach the 2/3 threshold, that maybe just go for a simple majority. So the heads of states are in a position to really decide what they want.
All right. One more thing before we let you go. There was a very serious allegation made by the U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, William Entwistle. I think he's outgoing ambassador now. The fact that some lawmakers in the House of Representatives got engaged in some very non-complimentary act while in the U.S. That issue is now being currently investigated by a committee set up by the House of Representatives. And I suppose you were supposed to be there as well. I don't know. What exactly happened? What inside information do you have on this issue?
Well, I've agreed to go to the House I've been summoned, in fact, to the House. So, to that extent, the matter is sub judice. That is to say, it is still being investigated. So it wouldn't be appropriate for me in a public forum to address that issue.
Well, the appearance of the U.S. ambassador was also brought into question. The issue was that by the Vienna Convention, he can be summoned to such investigation. But some of the lawmakers are already saying he already threw himself into the arena when he brought the allegation to the fore and even said he has evidence to back up that, because it goes down to the issue of the values and how Nigerians are perceived outside country. If this matter is not investigated properly and evidence are provided, what would it do to the image of Nigeria internationally? And the need for these lawmakers also, who some of them are claiming innocence, also prove their case.
Yeah, I think this is really the problem that sometimes we have with the media, unfortunately. One really has to be rigorous in the facts and the information that they put in the public domain. I suppose also with social media, it does complicate things a bit, But I met with the U.S. ambassador, and look, they have not said anything on the matter in the media. He wrote a letter to the Speaker of the House saying there were these allegations made. And he felt obliged to do that because the representatives were going there in the framework of something that had been organized by the Department of State of the U.S. and the House, and it's something that's annual. And so he felt an obligation just to bring it to his attention. That was all. He never ever, the U.S. government has never said anything else other than that, other than there were these allegations. I'm just informing you of that, full stop. And on the basis of that, all kinds of stories have come. Video this, that, the other, and all kinds of things. But there's absolutely no basis to any of that.
All right. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. We've been speaking to Geoffrey Onyema, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's joined us to look at several issues apart from the key issue which we brought him here. That's the launch of the AU passport and Nigeria's hopes and commitments towards ensuring that really works. Thank you so much, sir, for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Very much, Honorable Minister. He's brought clarity to a couple of issues, insisting that Nigerian ambassadors all across the country, all across the world, will not leave any Nigerians stranded deliberately, and that some of the reports we get in the media are not necessarily factual.
He does seem to have a lot of problem with the media. A little problem with the media.
Yeah,
anyway.
Serious problem.
Some parts of the media, I'm sure.
Some parts of the media.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Well, we'll be giving you U reports. Of course, U reports comes in every Thursday, and that is a feedback to questions sent in earlier that helps guide policymakers and certain things and certain steps to take. Do stay with us. That's coming up next.
As a unit